Welcome back to Patrick Christie's Tonight. Absolutely bonkers story this, but it could affect all of us. So after a group of Swiss geriatrics alongside Greta Thunberg convinced the ECHR that their government had breached their human rights by failing to protect them from climate change, a dangerous precedent has been set. A precedent that could have far-reaching consequences, including on these shores. Now, this is the latest development, okay? That's exactly what Doug Paulley, who is a 46-year-old disability rights campaigner, is hoping. Paulley, who suffers from diabetes, nerve damage and a heart condition that meant that he apparently hibernates during heat waves, is also now suing our government over the weather. So his legal challenge is this: along with Friends of the Earth and a man who lost his home to coastal erosion, it will be heard at the High Court in June, where they will argue the government isn't doing enough to tackle climate change. So where does this madness end? Well, I'm joined now by the leader of the Climate Party, Ed Gemmell. Ed, with respect, why should the government be sued by a man who has a variety of different issues that the climate may or may not affect? Why should we all be giving this guy a payout?
I think to begin with, I mean, we've got to look at the fact that everybody has a right to protection. We should be looking after everybody, and we have a National Health Service to look after everybody anyway. That's a duty of care that governments have. Under the European Convention on Human Rights, of course, they have a very specific duty of care to deal with these things. So they must be doing it. Now, whether or not this case will get through and whether or not the government will be found to be liable for it remains to be seen. But I think that in the sort of balance of evidence on that, you've got to look at whether the government is actually doing enough. I mean, there has already been a challenge to the government, let's go back 2 years, by Client Earth, where they brought a challenge in the High Court, which was saying we don't have plans which are credible in order to get us to net zero.
This guy has won almost all of the, get this, 40 disability discrimination cases he's launched over the last decade. This court case is supposed to be in June. If we have a hot June, he's supposed to be hibernating then, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, OK, possibly. Let's hope that we don't have a hot June and that he's actually able to get to the court and everything else. What would seem different is the previous cases he's been taking have been all related to disability. This is related to climate change.
But because of his disability, disproportionately affects him, he says, because of his disability.
Right, because he's vulnerable. OK, not just because of his disability. Anybody who's vulnerable to those effects that are coming. And let's just look at it for 1 second on a climate change aspect. We just had 2 weeks ago confirmation that in Antarctica, they had 38.5 degrees above the average temperature. So above the average temperature. So just imagine that coming in June or July of this year, and let's hope it never does. But just imagine taking our average temperature of 20 or 25 degrees.
We just had the wettest April.
We've just had nearly 10% extra water over these previous months, which of course has caused huge problems, flooding, potholes been gouged out, and all these other things.
It's not over easy, is it?
And it's potentially going to be a problem for our farmers, of course, coming through. Although the ridiculous part, of course, on that, getting off topic here, but the ridiculous part on that is we're going to apparently go into a drought because we haven't stored all the water that's been coming.
Yeah.
Different issue. But actually looking at this, we could be having a freak 40 degree has just happened in Antarctica.
Look, where does this end at, right? Someone born with one lung, right, who also happens to have asthma, who lives through, who was born next to like a railway line or something like that, or born next to the M1. Do they sue the government for not doing enough to protect them? I mean, that's the logical end to this, and that's madness.
As you know, we've debated ULEZ, low traffic neighbourhoods, and all these sorts of things here, which link in with air quality, and people have been taking action related to air quality in all different sorts of levels of both courts and other appeals. So it's not unusual for people to take action based on damage to their health.
But if we are looking at, and I am not trying to diminish the vulnerability and the disability of this person, but if we reduce our government's level of responsibility to the lowest common denominator of people, okay, then we will not be able to function as a country. In order to cater for this man's needs, we would have to sink into the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, we're mixing a number of different issues here to some extent. And I mean, it actually comes down to when you're looking at that kind of level, you're starting to come down to funding issues and everything else, and actually how much money do we have available to fund and look after people in all sorts of different circumstances. And you've heard arguments which have been aired on this show before about local government funding, children's services, adult services, and all that sort of thing. And then how can you spread that money across everybody satisfactorily to make sure they all have a good life? It's difficult. So there's no question there's difficulty here. Come back to the legal part of it, is there are legal obligations on the government, both under the Climate Change Act in terms of the emissions they should should be getting the pathway for emissions and under the European Convention of Human Rights to protect vulnerable people.
Is there any evidence whatsoever that if we had done just a little bit more in terms of the climate, that a bloke's house would not have been lost due to coastal erosion?
Of course, I couldn't tell you now that if we managed to reduce our emissions by another 5%, the guy's house wouldn't have gone. I mean, it's a very, very difficult one.
It's the sea, right? It's the sea. The world has the sea. We've got countries like India, China, etc., pumping out all of that stuff. There's nothing we could have done, sadly, is there? Sadly, because this person has lost something. I do feel for them. There's nothing we could have done to stop that happening. Why are we paying for that?
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's just switch it a little bit, but keep it on a fairly similar topic. I mean, I'm actually looking forward to the first case that comes that says to the UK government, you haven't done enough to build the economy here, because this direction of net zero is this enormous commercial opportunity that we should be pursuing. And why aren't you pursuing it? Because if you pursued it, and we had a lot more money in the pot here, we'd be able to pay for protection needed, whether it's for a house, for vulnerable people, or for anything else. The government isn't doing enough in a lot of different cases. Some of those things are covered, of course, by laws at the moment where they can be sued, and some aren't. I wish we had a law that said the government isn't doing enough to grow our economy. It's not taking account of the direction of travel of the entire world, and it should be. And we'd like to be getting it done so that we can pay for these things.
If this guy could take the government to court over whether or not they're doing enough to tackle climate change because of his vulnerabilities, could people who live next to a migrant hotel not take the government to court over the issues with their own personal safety?
I would have thought under the European Convention of Human Rights, they could take the government to court. Whether they'd win is completely different. And we don't know this guy's going to win either. He's
got a good track record.
No, he has got a good track record. And, and let's hope that we actually push the boundaries forward and get some of these things happening.
Good stuff. Look, Ed, thank you very, very much. Great to have you on the show, as ever. That is the leader of the climate party there, Ed Gemmell. Right, look, thank you very much for that. Doug Paulley has said this: I kind of agree with Al Gore and Greta Thunberg that concentrating on adapting to climate change is admitting defeat in tackling climate change itself. But given we are seeing climate change now and people are suffering and dying around the world as a result, it's incredibly important that governments put in suitable plans to mitigate the impacts. Coming up, Saudi fans on the lash at the football.